Lee's book, Stranger in the Shogun City, is a really transformative read. That's what happens when you read this book. It will take you into an entirely strange and particular world in 19th century Japan, and it will also transform you. That's the remarkable thing about this book. So it's about a young woman growing up in a Buddhist family in Japan in the 19th century, and her family are tasked with the care of a temple. And so what that means is they have enormous records and documents about their life. And so Amy Stanley seems to have gathered and marshaled all this material and managed to reconstruct this woman's world. She is an ordinary woman in so many ways, but like all ordinary women, she is also extraordinary. And the story follows her various marriages. She marries 4 times, including to a samurai. And it's about her efforts to forge her own life. And she leaves the temple to go to a new burgeoning city called Edo.
In some ways, I think she's achieved the most difficult and in some ways the most valuable thing a historian can. I mean, we're used to reading in history books about what happened, who did what, and why it happened. But what she achieves here is in explaining how it felt in this remote place at this remote time for someone who, on the face of it, has nothing in common with people of the present day. But she makes this woman's life understandable, relatable, and moving in its detail. And I think there really is no higher achievement for an academic historian.
I was interested in Japan since I was a child because my father was a scientist who had a lab. And he had postdocs come to his lab from Japan. And the culture of labs is that there's a lot of socializing. And so I got to know his favorite postdoc and his family quite well. And they had come from Tokyo. And I didn't have the opportunity when I was in high school to study Japanese. But when I got to college, there were Japanese courses offered. So I started studying Japanese. And your first year of Japanese, you take Japanese every day. And you don't learn anything. I mean, you can barely learn to read on the level of a kindergartner. So I did it for an entire year, and I thought, well, I still haven't gotten anywhere. I might as well do it for another year. And then I thought, well, I might as well do it for another year. And then the only major I could choose that could combine all this Japanese that was eating up my schedule with actually being able to finish college was East Asian Studies. And I had this advisor who was a historian, and he was a historian of 17th to 19th century Japan. And he said, you know, if you're interested in Japan and you're interested in history, you should study the Edo period because there are so many documents that you can even read people's shopping lists.
What I loved about this book is that when I started reading it, I had to put it down after about 30 pages because I had to check that it was actually non-fiction. It feels so literary, it feels imagined. But what's so brilliant about Stanley's writing is that she does something extraordinary to historical writing. So history is often about strict adherence to documents, to the paper trail of a person's life. And Amy Stanley does that. She sticks closely to the evidence of this woman's life. But then she pieces together all the parts in between. So she starts to imagine how this woman might have felt when her marriages failed. She starts to empathize with the kind of stigma and rejection and defeat you might feel as a young woman.
So when I wrote this book, what I really wanted was for the reader to have a sense of what it felt like to live in 19th century Japan. And I mean that very literally, you know, to kind of feel the cold that seeps through the walls in the snow country, or to smell the kind of scent of the wood fire in the hearth, or to hear the voices of people coming through the thin walls of a city tenement, or to hear the songs of peddlers in the alleyways. So it's that kind of experience of immersion in a different time and place that I'm hoping that the reader gets out of this book. So what's interesting about writing about Japan is that I'm in dialogue with historians who've written about Japan in English, and also historians of Japan who are in Japan who write about Japan in Japanese. And there's a much larger body of scholarship about the history of Japan and the history of Japanese women that's being written in Japan, and it's immensely rich and varied. So it's hard for me to say, I've discovered something that nobody has ever seen before. But I will tell you what surprised me the most. And that was the kind of vividness and directness with which Tsuneno expressed herself. Because I had always thought, as a historian of this period, even as a historian who specialized in women and gender, that when I read the writings of women, they would be very polite, very indirect, full of poetic allusions. And what I found in Tsuneno's writing was this kind of blunt self-assertion. And it wasn't just her, it was some of the other women that she quoted in her own letters home.
What Amy Stanley does in this book is focuses on the life of a single person, this very obscure, totally undistinguished lady, Tsuneno, who grew up in a temple on the snowy side of Japan and who moved to the great city of Edo, which we now know as Tokyo, in the early 19th century. And in telling her story, which had many ups and downs, was in many ways a very unconventional life for a woman at that time, she also brilliantly captures the atmosphere and the milieu of the city of Edo, this brilliant city of art, spectacle, performance and culture, which is now so remote from us today.
I think the judges could see in this novel a remarkable level of research and skill, and Stanley has obviously been completely immersed in the archive of this woman's life, and she pieces it together meticulously, and that is an astonishing thing to have done. But in addition to that, it's a deeply empathetic book and an imaginative book about what a person's life could have been like, and when you read it, you realise how remarkable it is to be able to reach back to the 19th century, to this ordinary woman, and pluck her out of it and have that world realised in front of you, which is what this book does. So it's a really worthy nomination for the shortlist.
So the raw material of these documents, although there's a lot in there, the story is there. Of course, it's not enough in itself to make a book, and Amy Stanley clearly, you can see from her notes in her bibliography, has done remarkably in-depth reading in Japanese as well as English sources, which is used to fill out the stuff of these documents with the rich details of the life of Edo, Japan. And it's a world that we glimpse in, for example, Japanese woodblock prints of the 19th century and 18th century by artists such as Hokusai Utamaro, and also the kabuki theatre, the famous kabuki theatre captures some of that world. But she's filled it out with reading in history, primary and secondary sources of that time. She evokes in really very exciting detail this moment in Japan's history.
All through the rest of 1838 and into 1839, Tsuneno was desperate. She had never recovered from the illness she suffered in Takata, and her ailment seemed psychological as well as physical. She wrote later that she had intended to die. Giyu attributed her suffering to her personal failings. She was married, but the marriage failed due to her selfishness, and soon after she was divorced, her health deteriorated. He had little patience for his sister's weakness. His wife, Sano, was expecting another baby at the end of the summer, and the house was full. He started making plans to send Tsuneno away. Perhaps there was a widower somewhere who needed help with housework and wouldn't mind an older bride with an unfortunate history. If I stayed at home, Tsuneno wrote later, they were talking about sending me to another terrible place to marry a widower. I was terrified to disobey, but I didn't want to marry a widower. I was being forced into something that I just refused to do. She didn't want to cause trouble, and she knew her mother and her brother thought her behavior was intolerable. I understand that my own unacceptable conduct has tried my family's patience, she wrote. She had already failed at marriage 3 times, and this instance of disobedience would only confirm her brother's low opinion of her. But she knew she couldn't marry again. She had to summon her courage. When I wasn't brave, she reflected later, I got caught up in unpleasantness no matter what I did. She refused every proposal. Later, she described her resistance as a wooden door reinforced with metal. It was one of the only times she used a metaphor. She usually confined herself to literal descriptions. But the image of the door must have appealed to her. It was a plain, ordinary thing, but it was far stronger than it looked. It wouldn't break no matter how many times it was hit. It would stand for years, ugly and battered. But eventually, it would warp so badly that it could never be opened. There had to be something else, a proposal she could make herself, another option, so she wouldn't have to spend the rest of her life saying no. She could go to Edo.